Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara, and tonight I will be talking to you about the history of fashion. You would have to be walking around with a bag over your head not to realize that fashion is everywhere. Fashion has influence on our media, music, and our society. I will start by going through each decade and discussing the eras and how fashion has evolved, how trends evolve, and how modern day fashion is influenced by our past. The first era that I'd like to discuss is the flapper era. This was the year when women first gained their independence. The style of that time period were bell skirts, very short skirts for the very first time. Skirts fell 7 to 10 inches below the knee, and most of the times the arms were bare. The colors that were popular during that time period were bright blues, red, and subdued pastels. The next era was the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time of hardship for many of the American families. Their only escape from harsh realities was the media and television. Movies were very huge during that time period. All of the gowns of that period were very glamorous, heavily beaded, and fur coats were popular during that time. The 1940s was the biggest influence on fashion in the U.S. During the 1940s, World War II had just begun. The 1940s changed the fashion world forever. On June 14, 1940, Paris fell to Germany. Berlin then became the known fashion capital of the world. The U.S. stationed battleships between the mid-Atlantic, which enabled the New York fashion designers to go across seas to view the fashion shows of Paris. Because of that, they were unable to come back and recreate the fashions of Europe. Due to this, the U.S. had to find a way to still market fashion to their consumers. Their way of doing this was to come up with classic pieces that lasted longer than just one period. For several reasons. A lot of times during the war, fashions were hard to come by, so they needed clothes that were going to last, that were classic, that could last from season to season. This was the era where ladies' suits were designed. The 1950s is the next era. This was the era of rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Audrey Hepburn, and Jackie O were huge fashion icons of this time period. Casual dresses became very popular during this time period. Fitted evening wear, heart-shaped appliques, strapless bodice, and tight skirts were popular during this period. Denim jeans were also introduced during this era. This was the first time in fashion where history began to repeat itself. In the 1950s, a lot of the fashions from the 1930s began to reappear, such as beaded handbags, floral prints, and pillback skirts. The 1960s is the next era. 1960s was the era of hippies and the mod look. Slim-fitting, bright, bold garments were popular during that period. Very short dresses and miniskirts were also a hit during the 1960s. The 1970s was the next era that I will be discussing. This was the era of disco and glam. Everything was all about sequins, bright lights, and roller skating. Denim jeans became very popular during this era. The next decade would be the 1980s. In the 1980s, this was the era of punk rock. The huge icons of that era were Michael Jackson and Madonna. Accessories were huge during that period. Basically, the more the better. The retro look was in. Anything that glittered and sparkled. Acid wash jeans were introduced for the very first time. Skinny jeans were introduced. Slap bracelets and jumpers were a popular look for the 1980s. The 1990s would be considered the anti-fashion era. This was the era where basically fashion just died. Not a lot of people really got into fashion anymore in the 1990s. A lot of the fashions from the 60s and the 70s began to reappear. Dark colors became more popular during the 90s, maroons and dark blues. Doc Martens were popular during this era, and tie-dye also reappeared from the 70s. Later in the 90s, bright popular colors became very trendy during that time period, such as hot pinks, lime greens, and fluorescent oranges. So as you can see, the fashions of the past have now resurfaced, and in 2000 to 2008, basically anything goes. Okay, so in conclusion to my presentation, I'd just like to say that fashion today is that of the past, and the fashions that our grandparents and parents of that time period are popular to today.